It's really interesting because when you study the physiology of pain perception, you learn about how so much of it, of pain, is in our subjective control. Pain signals are ultimately felt, or they're regulated in the cortex of our brain. The cortex is the most recently evolved, the most recently developed region of our brain. We're pretty sure it's responsible for why we're conscious as humans. For us, human beings, large aspects of our pain experience are a subjective experience. Subjective means we can manipulate it, right? It's not objective, it's not set in stone. We can manipulate it consciously. That's how you can get things like Buddhist monks dousing themselves in gasoline and burning themselves alive without flinching, right? That's how that's possible. There is a very literal mind over matter aspect to pain. Your brain doesn't have to accept that pain inputs coming from the rest of your body have to be interpreted as painful. It's really trippy, but that's kind of how it works. And comedy plays in that same space, sort of our modulation of our pain experience via input from the cortical layer of our brain. Hopefully none of this is getting too crazy for anyone or too heady. I think it's crazy interesting. That's why I'm talking about it. I listened to this excellent audiobook, would recommend it to anyone. It's called Wonderworks by Angus Fletcher. So Dr. Fletcher, he's a professor of story science at Ohio State University. And he's working on something called Project Narrative. Crazy interesting. I'll put links to that in the video description if you want. Super, super interesting stuff. So he wrote this proof, little side note, he wrote this proof about how computers can't think narratively and how that puts a hard cap on the artificial intelligence capabilities of robots. So like humans, we think in narrative, we think in story because of how the animal neuron, neurons, the cellular units of our nervous system, those function fundamentally differently on a hardware level from computer hardware. So that leads to fundamental differences with very far-reaching consequences in how computers and robots function versus how human beings function. Everybody worries about, robots taking over the world. I always thought that was a little silly because robots don't have an underlying motivation structure, right? They don't have a hypothalamus in their brain telling them to seek out food and sex, the way that humans do. The hypothalamus, that's the source of our basic, fundamental motivations in life. Computers don't have that. So you have to tell a computer what to do. You have to give it a goal. It doesn't come up with its own goals. But anyway, Dr. Fletcher has this very interesting discussion of story science and how it relates to artificial intelligence, Project Narrative. Go check that out if you're into computer science, AI, biology, psychology, neurology, literature, all those fun things that go well in combination. Sidebar, I just want to tell people about that because I think it's so cool. But anyway, getting back to what I'm trying to talk about, Dr. Fletcher, he wrote this book, Wonderworks, and it's all about the psychological and emotional effects of literature. And I think it's such a refreshing way to approach stories. If you didn't like literary analysis in school, where you try to pick the themes out of a story, what was the author trying to say here? What were the logical stances being put forward by this work of art? So Fletcher, Angus Fletcher, doesn't approach stories that way. He's forget that. We don't care about that. What he's interested in is the emotional effects of stories. And he ties those emotional effects in with what is happening inside the human mind on the neurological level. So, what areas of the brain are being activated when we read or hear certain stories? What effect does that have on us emotionally, right? And it's interesting because this stuff is somewhat predictable. Literature can almost be like a form of medicine.